Greetings and welcome back to Creative Briefing. Okay, I'm Adam from Influx Media Production, digital media content creation agency for small businesses and entrepreneurs, and also I'm here at Creative Briefing trying to encourage and motivate people in all walks of life, creatives or non-creative, to explore their own personal creativity. I always say it's the better part of our humanity, our ability to create something, be original, and great digital tools and lots of obviously non-digital tools out there to help us explore creativity in whatever shape or guise or format that creativity may come in. So today I'm going to start a series on photo editing, and I'm going to start by looking and taking quite a deep dive into Adobe's Camera Raw. Camera Raw has been around for a long time, and it's evolved. It's in its, I think, was it the 9th generation of Camera Raw, but it's been around a long time. It's very mature. It can do a lot of the initial color correction setting up before you take it into Photoshop and maybe do some artistic stuff, or it can really do a lot of what, if you're familiar with the sorts of digital Lightroom stuff like Lightroom or Aperture, for those sort of color correction, creative color tweaking, you can do a lot of that in Camera Raw, and I'm going to be going through each of the tabs, the palettes that are in Camera Raw, and show you what it can do, and how it operates, because it's a little different than many other sort of creative softwares. So let's dig right in and see. So I've got a folder in Photoshop, actually in Bridge. Actually, we'll start in Bridge. Opened a series of a folder on my drive somewhere of a bunch of photographs from a family trip to Bryce Canyon. Remember vacations? Remember when we could go places? Remember when we could go to national parks? It's only a year ago, but it seems like a lot longer. Anyway, so I've got some lovely photographs here, and I'm going to, edit them. They were shot in the RAW format. So a little preamble about the RAW format. These files are all in the .nef, which stands for the Nikon electronic format. It's a flavor of RAW. I think each of the camera companies have their own RAW. It's like a standard set of protocols, I guess, for having the ability to, much like you did with film, and once you shot the film, you were able to then take that film into a dark room and then change how it got exposed, a little bit. So what was shot on the negative wasn't necessarily what you were going to get on the print. You had some give and take here or there. And before the RAW format, what you took on a digital camera, often just in JPEG format, that was it. There was no real sort of give or take. With the RAW format, there is some give and take to overexpose, underexpose. The actual shot is not really the shot. It's just the pixels are arranged, and there's some data that was captured, like what type of camera and lens you were using, what the camera settings were, and there is some extensibility within that format to overexpose, underexpose, change the color balance, the white balance, and the color settings, and we'll sort of get into that. So that's the RAW format, and that's where Camera Raw was born from. This universal RAW format that allows you to capture an image, but then that isn't really the final image. You are able to then develop it before it then becomes a print, to use old analog celluloid film analogies. Having said that, though, Camera Raw can work with TIFF, it can work with JPEG, it can work with any file format to, manipulate and save an image that may have been not quite captured. Even say cameras on cell phones or iPads are reasonably good these days. So you can, it's not limited. Camera Raw is not limited to raw images. So I'm working with NEF files, as I said, which is Nikon's version of Camera Raw. I don't have a professional camera. I just have the lowest of low consumer models. It's a D40, which is years old, and a bit of a dinosaur, but it captures raw images, and it's it's a slight improvement over cell phone cameras. It gives me the ability to change lenses, gives me the ability to manually set settings, and it's small and lightweight, so it's fine for my purposes. There's like sort of a lightweight camera, a vacation camera, without having to lug a more high-end professional bit of kit around. So let's take a look then at where are we going with this. Let's go into, so I'm in Bridge, and like I said, I've opened this folder on my desktop of all the NF files that I shot on my D40 last summer in Bryce. And if I right click on this, I can open, and it will open with the default, which is going to be Photoshop. I can open with, and it's going to show me obviously Photoshop is the default and give me any other image editors, but I can open in Camera Raw. So Camera Raw is like an extension of the Adobe image editing sort of programs, Lightroom, Photoshop, and in this case I've got Bridge. So I can open it in Camera Raw without Photoshop being open. I can open it in in Bridge. I can look at it in Bridge and then open it from Bridge into Camera Raw without having to open Photoshop and do my manipulations and then sort of close it and move on. So I'm going to open in Camera Raw, and I can I can do my image exposures, and then I can hit done, and then those settings are now saved, and you can see the preview file is showing what it looks like. I can then, if I go over to, actually if I right click and reveal in Finder, you're going to see right here underneath Bryce 12, there is Bryce 12 XMP, and this is how Camera Raw, Adobe Camera Raw works. It's going to put a XMP, which is a whole bunch of sort of metadata that's basically saving those settings that I just did in in the Camera Raw program, and save them next to the image. Now I deleted that file, and now I go back to Bridge. You can see that those settings have been discarded, and we're right back to where we started. So that's the essence of Camera Raw, the XMP files, and Bridge / Photoshop. The settings are non-destructive. The image is the image, and I can apply a number of settings to that image, and they are parked next to the image, but it's never actually baked into the image. So here we are back again, and I can let's open with Photoshop. Now it's going to take me into Photoshop, but it's going to launch the Photoshop Camera Raw plugin for Photoshop. It's the identical interface, has the identical functions. I can do the same, make a sort of mess of that, and I can hit done, and I go back to Bridge, and those settings you can see that I just made in Photoshop have been parked in the XMP file next to the raw image. So that's how it works. If I go back to Photoshop, well, I didn't save the image, so it hasn't remembered that, but let's go back to Bridge and open it with Photoshop again, and of course brings us back to Camera Raw plugin, and those settings are already loaded for us. I'm going to cancel that and go back to Bridge real quick and open it once again in Camera Raw again. So there's a mirror there of how it behaves. Bridge or Photoshop, it's going to behave in the same way. It's going to reference any existing XMP settings that are parked next to the actual image file, the NEF, the JPEG, or whatever other sort of raw format it might be, and it's going to launch the Camera Raw plugin before, you know, taking you onto the program. So if let's reset all this, just go back to as shot again. We're right back to square one. So let's take a quick look at what the Camera Raw plugin controls offer us. So across the top here we have, you know, presentation layer and image editing tools. We can zoom, and if you're used to Photoshop or other, you know, Adobe suite, you know, programs, Command plus, Control plus or minus will allow us to zoom in. Double click on that will bring you to like actual pixel size. Command 0 will bring you to fit into view. We've got the hand, which can also be, if I double click on there again, I've got the hand tool here that can also be accessed by hitting the space bar, where I can sort of pan around. So that's, if you're used to that, we have an eyedropper tool which gets into when we're doing color editing, the color correction, the eyedropper tools and the target eyedropper tools, if you're familiar with using those in Photoshop, they are mostly identical. We have a crop tool which gives us some, you know, some presets, normal, which is just freestyle. Then we have 1:1, 2:3, you know, sort of some fairly common ratios, or you can put in your custom ratio, crop ratio, and constraint image doesn't really actually do anything, but if I hit in here to crop, I can then, you know, move around, I can return to accept that, I can go back to crop, and I can choose to clear the crop. So there's some non-destructive cropping tools right there. We have a straighten. If I wanted to straighten the horizon, I can go ahead and do that. And we have some image transformation tools where we have uprights, and it will scan and do some automatic corrections, or you can start to mess with the geometry. If, say, for example, maybe you've got, obviously this isn't a great example of this image, but say you've got buildings or maybe a box if you're shooting some packaging and it's not quite, you know, 100% square or plumb or level, you can mess with a lot of that and really just fine tweak the details numerically, and these tools will help you do that. And I'm just going to zero these out because obviously that's not really going to help. Put the scale back to 100% and call that good. I can rotate the actual image, the actual canvas of the image. I'm going to undo all of that. So we have spot removal tool and the red eye removal tool and an adjustment brush and a gradient filter, and I'll get to those in a little bit. All the color correction tools are here on the right hand column, and if I just go back to the main, one of the non-image editing tools, just go back to the zoom tool for now, and you see we get all these tabs across that perform a number of color correction functions. And let's go through these one at a time. So the first tab is basic, and you know, the first thing we have is the white balance, and we have some presets. If it was shot with the wrong white balance setting, and you know it was daylight, we can put, you know, a different sort of preset in, and that's fine. We can even use the wrong preset to get some special effects, but I'm going to keep it as shot. And then you can tweak this. Is like the temperature is like the coarse adjustments, and the tint is like the fine tuning. So if it's got a slight sort of color tint one way or another, you can adjust that. Then we get into like the exposure. You can overexpose or underexpose it to correct for any overexposing or underexposing. And I'm going to start to work on my image as we go, as I talk about each of these. And it's slightly overexposed, so I'm going to underexpose it. I'm going to lower the exposure a little bit. And this is what I was talking about what Camera Raw does. It allows us to compensate for any indiscrepancies in the original shot. If it was shot overexposed a little bit, you can compensate without, and the key point is without image degradation. Of course you can go into a JPEG and tweak these settings and you'll get varying degrees of image degradation. But with Camera Raw, it's lossless. What you're doing is not destroying the pixel data. So I can lower the exposure. I can then, let's reset the contrast to what it was, and I'm going to increase it just a little bit. Highlights and shadows will allow us to, if our highlights are blown out, I can pull this down to bring back some detail into the highlights. So it's creating contrast in the highlight areas, and the same for the shadows. If the shadows of areas have been underexposed, we can pull this down and it's gonna, or we can increase it, in fact, the opposite to the way the highlights work. We are lightening the shadows, creating sort of contrast to the dark areas of the shadows stay dark, but we're introducing some detail. Really what highlights and shadows do is we're introducing detail or restoring detail into those areas. And then whites and blacks really is setting the black point and the white point. How bright we want our brights, how dark do we want our darks, and we can sort of tweak those to taste. And then again, it's a bit of a push and pull, go back between each of these exposure. These are all the basic exposure settings. Then we get to the like the saturation settings down here, and clarity introduces contrast at the edges. So if we increase clarity, it's going to create greater contrast, but just around the edges to make things perceptively sharper. So a little bit of that doesn't hurt. Then we have vibrance and saturation. There's a little bit of confusion around vibrance and saturation. They both do kind of the same thing. If we slam that up, you can see everything gets really saturated. If we do the same thing with saturation, does the same thing. But where the differences lie, if we look at what vibrance does and we increase this, you can see the sky gets really blue, but the trees and the canyon, the red rocks, don't get saturated as proportionally. So it disproportionately saturates like blues. I found it's really good for skies, but it really sort of doesn't. I think it was designed not to mess with skin tones. So anything in the sort of the reds and yellows and oranges, it doesn't oversaturate those. It might bump it a little bit, but the proportional ratio is sort of lesser in those skin tone areas. Whereas if I bring this back down, and I should say, you can see if I hover over the saturation. Let me go into full screen mode. Maybe it's a little larger. We can see there's this sort of scrubby icon, so I can scrub. Sometimes, that's good if you're doing sort of coarse settings. And if I hold down Shift, it will go very quickly. That's typical of all sort of Photoshop or Adobe. Well, I'll say Adobe because Illustrator and InDesign, they sort of tend to be, there's a different coding team, so they behave a little differently in certain circumstances. Definitely among the image editing softwares. So I found that to be less useful, because you can see it just gets a little wild. Scrubbing the title bar is useful. Sometimes when you really want to go in micro increments, it's just better to drag the little wedge there. It would be nice, I know in some Photoshop operations, if I hold down Command or Command or Option, it will allow me to scrub in finer increments. After Effects behaves that way too. It would be nice if Camera Raw behaved that way as well, but it doesn't. But it's okay, you can just drag the slider. And so if I slam the saturation, you can see the blues don't get as proportionately saturated, but the yellow greens of the tree and the oranges of Bryce Canyon get really, really saturated. So I'm going to bump it up just a little bit under 10. So what happens is you're going to increase vibrance and increase saturation a little bit less than that, and it's going to be that sort of setting, and how much you want to do it, but they're going to be in that sort of relationship to each other. Usually I'm going to increase saturation around about the 10 mark, and maybe about 20 to 30 on the vibrance, depending on what I'm going for. Now you can push and pull these. So if I really increase the vibrance but reduce the saturation, you can see that the trees and the landscape are sort of completely desaturated, but there's still a fair bit of blue in the sky. So for special effects or a particular look you're going for, that can be sort of fun to play with. Now of course, if I take saturation down to 0 or minus 100, it's zero saturation is zero saturation. There's no color. If I slam the saturation and reduce the vibrance, we can see that the sky is almost completely washed out, but there's a little bit of color left in the trees and the green, yellows and the oranges. So again, it's can be used creatively as well as sort of functionally. It's good to be aware of. So let's bring that back up to about 30ish, and let's see right there. Okay. Next tab. So right off the bat, we have this little flyout menu here, and it has some. You can apply the previous conversion if you're doing a set of images and they all want to follow the same sort of set, and you want to maybe apply a setting that you've sort of done before. Previous conversion works there. You can apply the defaults. You can save presets. You can export these settings for someone else to use those XMP files. You can load and save. You can build a library of XMP settings. So this is like the flyout menu that is available on all of these tabs. So the next tab is the tone curve, and this is like curves, like it is in Photoshop. If you're used to using that, you can add and create your S curves as you might want to, and then you've got a preset here for medium or strong contrast. So you can just go back to linear to sort of reset it, and you can work on the red or the green or the blue channels exactly like you would with the curves setting in Photoshop. We also have this parametric curve, and this has these little sliders down at the bottom here that allow us to set the crossover point. We have these 4 parameters. It's parametric, so we have these 4 parameters: highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. So that's what the image is broken down to, and we can define where the highlights are, where the shadows are, and where the lights and darks are. So if we look at the histogram here, I can say, well, my lights, I can be just the brightest of the brights, like the center of the the clouds. I want those to be a little bit punchy. You can see I can punch those center of the clouds up, and then I can say, well, I can choose where that punchiness occurs. So if I really boost those highlights, but it's really defined by this section here. You see, and so this section here is the highlights. This section here, if you can see my cursor, that will be the lights. This section here would be the darks. This is the shadows. That's how this works. So I can say, look, a lot of this area, a lot of this image is going to be in the midtone, so I'm going to decrease. Well, let's say I'm going to increase the darks, but I'm going to decrease the shadows just to darken the darker areas, and I'm going to leave the lights largely how they are, increase the shadows a little bit, and I can sort of play with where these fall, and I'm going to just darken off the shadows, which is just down here in this region. So quite a cool little tool, a variation on the curves tool. Then of course I can go in, it compounds, I can go in and then, you know, use my more familiar tool just to introduce maybe a slight S-curve on top of what I've just done. I can go in and let's see, let's try and make let's make a little post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear apocalyptic landscape. Do some actual creative color correction. Really sort of destroy this image. So with our actual color curves, I can start getting creative with the color and seeing how I want to play with this. Let's go back to the green and make it a bit more green. So I'm just playing around here, trying to get a look that I'm happy with, or at least it's a good sort of baseline. Well, that's kind of getting a little post-apocalyptic. We'll go with that. Go with that for now. Let's move on to the detail, and this is where we do our sort of sharpening and noise reduction. Sharpening is very similar to unsharp mask in Photoshop, and I like to add a fair amount but reduce the radius. It's around 0.6 or 0.7. Nothing too much because the clarity function works in a very similar way. You don't want to over sharpen it, but just a touch, and unless it's particularly noisy or grainy, I don't really mess with the noise reduction. Then we get into our fine tuning of the colors. This is kind of like where the real creativity with the color comes, and it's really fun to play in this. We can convert to grayscale and create some, you know, duotone style, you know, shots, and you know, start messing with the ratios of a color, auto or default, or start messing with the mix. And this is going to compound upon what we've already done with our curves tool. So if you've skewed it one way, it's going to already be slightly in this blue-green area, which is what I've done. But I'm not going to convert to grayscale. I'm going to start mangling my color, my saturation, then my values. So each color frequency, it's sort of broken down by band: reds, oranges, yellows, greens, aquas, blues, purples, magentas. So it's sort of broken down by, you know, chunks on the sort of color wheel, and we can then go through and then, you know, push and pull these. There's not a lot of reds in here, so this isn't really doing anything. If I go to the oranges, I can skew them more towards yellows, or I can skew them more towards reds. I'm going to make them a little more red, and then yellows is really going to be in the trees, and skew those a bit more orange. Greens are going to skew a bit more yellow. Aquas is really going to be the sky, although actually it really isn't, so I'm going to leave that. Now the sky must be in the blues, right? So I'm going to bring this more towards the greens, the cyans, and then purples. There's obviously not a lot of purple in here, so this won't do anything. So as well as tweaking the color, I can decide with those color bands. Let's see, the oranges I want to be more saturated, which is the landscape. I want to punch those out a little bit because they were getting lost. The yellows I want to maybe saturate. Yes, keep a little bit of saturation into the leaves. But I'm going to pull down the greens a little. Aquas, there was nothing really in the aquas. It was the blues. So I'm going to desaturate the blues quite a lot. So they were getting a little strong, and purples and magentas, there wasn't anything to mess with there. So let's look at luminance. Now I can also make the oranges darker, as we can see with the, we'll make them brighter. I'm going to leave those as they were. I'm going to make the yellows and the tree a bit brighter so they punch out a bit more. Same with the greens. Aquas, there wasn't much of, but I'm going to make the blues a lot darker. Now we're getting this murky, post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear, you know, very dramatic sort of sky. So lots of fun to be had in the HSL tab. Then we get to split toning. Split toning, you see this balance key in the middle here, this slider. This decides which one of these color corrections we want to use, where it's going to err, if it's going to err on the side of highlights or err on the side of shadows. Now we can, now I'm going to maybe do something really extreme. Let's change the hue and really punch up the highlights. Let's say, right, let's make them kind of purple. So you can see I've really made the highlights super bright and nasty. But if I bring the balance back down to the shadow side of the scale, we don't get any of that. It's like that adjustment wasn't made, because the balance, if I leave one of these default and then hyper change the other, this is like a levels or a mount slider for that correction, and I can do it to the highlights, and at this extreme level it's really applying to the whole image. It really isn't just applying to the highlights at this level. If conversely I make this change to the shadows, let's see, make them dark bluish, and then start punching up the amount, you can see that the whole image is really getting skewed that way, and I can then slide this image back. So I can introduce a little bit of one or the other, or I can skew the brights yellow and skew the shadows purple, and you decide at the midpoint where the cutoff of brightness or you know of these two settings where that occurs. So that's kind of cool. It's kind of fun. Again, this is, if you use it judiciously, it can be quite, especially if you keep one of the settings at like sort of 0, and then you use the balance as like an amount slider. It's quite cool. So that's split toning. Lens corrections. If you enable the lens correction, you then default auto and custom, and then you have a lens profile, because that EXIF data exists in my camera raw file. It knows what lens it was shot with, and then I can change the amount of distortion that may have been introduced through the lens. I generally don't mess with this. I don't have high-end enough camera that it makes that much of a difference, to be honest with you. And you get into chromatic aberration, and I do know, actually, I do know that if I zoom into here, we will see some chromatic aberration. You can see right here there's a green fringe, and if I increase the green amount of the chromatic aberration, it will reduce that. No, I need to usually increase the, oh, I need to turn it on first. There you go. You can see that helped. I just know from experience that my camera does have some green chromatic aberration, so that's sort of fairly useful if you are familiar with your camera and lens settings. So this is getting into, and you can do some manual distortion to sort of fisheye, or you can, like sort of corner pinning, it can blow out either way. And if you see some distortion in the, you know, in your image, you want to manually tweak that, you can. Now, vignetting is usually used to de-vignette. If your lens tends to add some vignetting, some darkness around the edge, you can de-vignette it here. But you can use this in a creative. If I negatively, you can get a really lovely vignette that interacts with the other color corrections we've done here. So now we're starting to add to the drama. We've got this high point of the cloud in the distance, you know, right in our sort of center, almost eye level. We've got this tree in the foreground. We've got these moody clouds, and we've got a great vignette. We're starting to use these color correction tools creatively, and you can choose where the midpoint occurs. If you want to darken it, you can, you know, bring the midpoint down. If you want to just make a subtle vignette in the corners, you can slide it this way. I'm going to bring it down just below 50 a little bit to darken overall. So we're starting to stack these color corrections, and they're addressed, you know, from left to right in this tab order here, very conveniently. So we can work through and start to stack these color corrections to either just make our image look better, or use them creatively for an effect or a look. And again, like without, you know, overstating or repeating myself, which obviously I am, but a lot of this stuff is in Lightroom or something like Aperture. If you're used to those things, you can really do a lot of it in camera raw, non-destructively, and part of a maybe more Photoshop-centered workflow, I suppose. So dehaze is another one where we can start to sort of really blow it out and get it milky, or if we bring it this way, we really start to get dark and murky. Now it's a little bit too much. I'm going to go back to 0 and slowly add up a little bit of dehazing. It really, again, dehaze, stacking it on top of the vignette, it really builds upon that to really create this nasty looking post-apocalyptic world, or whatever other effect you're trying to go for. It doesn't have to be post-apocalyptic, just kind of what I chose to do. So grain can add in some noise to maybe break up some JPEG artifacting. Excuse me. I'm going to bring the size down a little bit. So bring up some grain, bring down the roughness, bring down the size. You can add some post-crop vignetting. And again, you can create like a family album, you know, white vignette, or we can build upon the dark vignette we've got by really blackening this out. Because we have the vignette we created with the lens correction tool, we can just build upon this. I like to just skew the midpoint this way this time, and this just kind of extra darkens up the corners. Again, we've got a lot more control over the some of the vignetting tool, whether it affects the highlights or not. But like I say, I like to stack that upon the lens vignetting here. Camera calibration, I don't use. I mean, this is getting into the technical weeds a little bit here. If you have a very high-end, you know, photography studio or photography setup that you've calibrated your camera to your system, that's beyond what I've ever needed to do, and so I've really avoided this tab. You're probably not going to worry about the camera calibration tab if you're watching this video, because if you're watching this video, you're not going to be worried about an introduction to Camera Raw. You're probably already deep in the weeds with that sort of level of technicality. So I'm going to skip over that. Presets is where all the settings we've made, I can save a new Camera Raw. No, don't want to do that. Where we go, apply preset, no, sorry, down here. It's not too intuitive, especially if you've got a larger monitor. This is all the way down here. Let's call, and you can choose which of the tabs, which of the operations within each tab are stored within this preset. So I'm going to turn off these because I don't use those. Yep, that looks good, and I'm going to call this dark world, and we're going to save that, and then now I've got my list of presets. I'll get more to presets later. So we can apply a preset from our list. Yeah, so we can come back to this. We can also apply them from Bridge. Again, like I said, I'll show you that in a moment. So snapshots are kind of like presets, but they're more useful for, let's say, let me see, let's go convert this one to grayscale, and we're gonna, yeah, let's just default to that. Let's maybe bring this way a little bit, and let's turn off the vignetting. Now I can go to a snapshot and save this as monotone, and I can, snapshots are really maybe steps along the way as you build your preset out, I guess. Functionally, I think snapshots should come before presets, because snapshots, I find, if I've got to a place that I like that, but I want to continue to develop it, I want to save where I'm at, I'm going to save a snapshot, much as you would with the snapshots in the history tab in Photoshop. So I'm happy with that, but let's say I want to keep messing. I'm just randomly chugging sliders here. Okay. Now I'll go back to this snapshot and go, okay, monotone 2, as I'm building my preset, and I can sort of toggle back and see where we've come. And maybe once I've reached the end of my experiments and I've got a number of presets snapshots along the way, then I can save this as a preset. Actually, I think I prefer, let's do this one. Let's just save this as a preset and call this monotonous. Get it? It's a joke. Right, so now that's a preset, but it's also a snapshot. So there's some overlap with what presets and snapshots do. I mean, they're both sort of saved in the XMP file, but I tend to look at snapshots much like snapshots to work in Photoshop, and that is they're sort of stepping stones along the way. You've got to a point you're happy with, but you want to keep developing. Whereas preset is a finished preset that you can, use and apply it sort of later. So that's the tabs across the top there. So let's say I'm happy with that. Now I can choose to save the image. Here at the bottom I can click on this and it's going to give me the export options. I can save that image out to an actual file on my desktop, which I'm not going to do now. I can open the image, which will open it in Photoshop or whatever the default is that you've set. And if you hover over it, it just gives me an option here. It says I can option click to open it without loading the metadata. But that's going to open the image with all these sort of presets done, or I can just click done, and what that does is that is going to save the XMP file next to the actual image in the directory. And you can see the preview is updating. It's showing me what that XMP file looks like, and I can quit Bridge. I can obviously Camera Raw is now shut down. I'm no longer in Camera Raw. Well, I could go to Photoshop and navigate to that file on my directory and open it, and it would load those. It would load this set of settings, but I'm not going to do that now. But what I can do, so that all that work is now saved, and I can come back at a later date. If I double click on it, it's going to open it in Photoshop, and it's going to bring me right into the Camera Raw plugin with those settings saved, and I can do the same thing, open the image or save or done, cancel, whatever, carry on editing. or I can, again, open in Camera Raw if I want to edit those settings again, or I can develop settings. In this menu, fly out here, all my presets are available to me. So I can choose the dark world setting that we worked on originally, and it's now going to update, and now those settings are applied for that preview. And when I double click, brings me into Photoshop, launches the Camera Raw plugin with that preset set of values, and I can hit open image. And here we are, that image is now pixels, ready for me to, you know, let's say got the ellipse, I'm gonna give it a 200 pixel feather, I'm gonna make a selection, Command J to float that to a layer, I'm gonna select the background and just do a quick Gaussian blur. Let's take a look at that. Let's slam it up fairly high. And so now I've got a bit of a, you know, lens blurring around the edge there. There's the blurred image, and there's the sort of focused central image. So I can then, you know, work on those. Any other sort of creative image editing processes I can do in Photoshop. I'm going to close that and not save, and go back to Bridge. So what else? I can place the image as is in other Adobe programs. I can copy it or move it to other, you know, folders in on my local drive. So that's largely, that's about, yeah, so let's reveal in Finder and let's go look at this. So here I have the XMP file again. Now, what I can do, I mean, so I've got the presets, but maybe, and you can probably export those presets and save them, but what I have tended to do is, let's say, let's rename this. I'm going to call it Dark World because that's what the preset is. Now, if I go back to, now it's back to the, sort of the standard as shot image because Bridge is no longer accessing the XMP file because we renamed it. So it can't find that. But if I, you know, I can always go back and then apply that preset because we have saved those settings as a preset, but as far as the preview goes, it's not showing that. If I quit, and then let's say I've got some other XMP files that I have saved from earlier, and I remove my sort of naming and just go it back to the name that Bridge is expecting, and I relaunch Bridge. It should find, yep, so it's found that setting that I sort of replaced. So that's a way you could create a library of looks or back up your presets or share your presets by renaming, copying and renaming and storing maybe in a library somewhere else your XMP files, and then as long as Bridge has access to the XMP file that is the same name as the, you know, what the image is. So in this case it's Bryce012, it's looking for Bryce012 XMP. So as long as though there's parity there, I mean, there is this, you know, purge cache for selection. It removes the cache if it doesn't update. Usually that will help, but you have to quit. I've found that you have to quit Bryce if you want to do that little trick where you're swapping XMP files around. Purging the cache doesn't always work, but rebooting bridge does. So that's just a little trick that I like to use for, like I say, creating a library of looks that I might want to either share between systems or share with clients or other users, that sort of thing. So I'm gonna, to demonstrate, let's go and I'm gonna rename this one back to nasty. I should have copied this. Now if you go back here, it's going to be set to the default. If let's get dark world, I'm going to duplicate dark world. And it's back to Bryce 012, goes back to its place. But if I come back to here, oh, okay, lo and behold, it has updated. That's cool. Sometimes it won't update and you have to purge the cache and it will reload. Sometimes it won't, that won't work at all. So just, obviously that's not always not really maybe the way that Bridge was, and Camera Raw was designed to work. So doesn't always behave as expected, but rebooting Bridge always does the trick. So just be aware of that. So that's cool. Let's go back into Camera Raw. I wanted to look at the spot editing tools. So across the top here we have these 4, 5 sort of spot tools. If I click on this, we get a different palette here. We still have the histogram at the top, but we have the heal or the clone brush. Clone is like the sample, the rubber stamp in Photoshop, and I can adjust the size before I add it. And again, this really is like, they've introduced this into Camera Raw recently. This is part of, like, if you're used to Aperture and Lightroom where you're sort of spot correcting, now you can do this in Bridge, and it's really great. I'm going to make this a little bigger. Got this nasty, got some schmutz on the lens. I'm going to click there, and now I'm going to sample it from over here, and it's removed that schmutz, and there's a smaller one over here. I'm going to click there, and that's kind of mostly cleaned that one up. Let's move this out of the way a little bit. Takes a little while to process, so that's really cool. So you can select the sample area and the healing area, but you can't change the size like after the fact. That really only changes the size of the brush for your next click. Okay, so we have the spot healing tool, and that's just going to be doing kind of like a content aware rubber stamp sort of healing, much like the tools that are in Photoshop. I've been saying that a lot, obviously, haven't I? Because there is obviously a lot of crossover with the algorithms that the Adobe programmers have built. So with red eye removal, then we have the adjustment brush. Kind of like the spot tool, the spot healing tool, but the brush tool allows us to be more creative. How so? So let's see. I want to maybe, let's click on this, and it puts a pin right here. So with this, it shows us the area that it's going to be affecting. It doesn't give us the circles like the heal brush does, but now I can edit any of these basic color settings. You'll recognize these are all the same that are in the sort of exposure, the exposure tab. I can then underexpose or overexpose maybe just that spot. I want to punch up those clouds just a tiny bit, but then bring back some of the highlights just to make a little hot spot right there. So just editing the color looks of just that brush, which is, as you can see, it's going to affect this area. The inner circle is the area it's going to affect, and then the outer area is the amount of feathering back to the unadjusted. Now you see this minus and plus. If I should have demonstrated this first, but if I click this, it's going to just like set a default for that sharpness and set everything else back to 0. So don't be mistaken that if I click sharpness, it's just going to decrease the sharpness. I'm going to have to drag the slider to do that. If I click this, it's going to reset everything else back to 0 and just, you know, take that down to whatever preset level Camera Raw has decided. So I can maybe add a color hue. Let's make it maybe more yellow. So it's going to add a sort of color hue to that. Here's where I can change the brush size, but again, I believe this is this affects the size of my next click, not the size of the currently activated. Let's see if that changes anything if I bring the size wheel down. So because I've got the add, I'm adding to the selected adjustment. If I hit new, I'm going to create a new hotspot. So you can compound, you can see how, if I show the mask, you can see that this mask down here and this mask up here is sort of large, because that was, like I said, when I clicked I had those settings here, and when I clicked this one I had those smaller brush settings there. So or if I can click to erase, if I click here, it's going to remove that setting completely. So not quite like working in Photoshop, but again, for some small spot adjustments, it's okay. But I mean, I think most of the time you're probably gonna do your broad strokes, your broad color corrections here, and then open it in Photoshop and do this type of other, you know, creative, maybe editing, spot editing in Photoshop. But just to know that these adjustment brushes, it is there. Again, it's very similar to some of the other digital post-processing programs like Lightroom and Aperture. Now there's a gradient tool as well, and I can create the gradient. And much like the brush tools, the gradient tools are here, and we can see the mask. It's darker at the bottom and lighter at the top, which means the bottom is not going to get affected with the color correction, but the top is. And we've added like a yellowy color hue to it, as you can see. I can bring the exposure down so it's darker at the top. I can go back in and change, so maybe I really just want the top of the image adjusted and I don't want too much of the lower image being adjusted. So I get a darker amount at the top and a yellow hue. And it looks like it adopted some of the settings that I used in the brush tool, but I can turn off the overlay so I don't have to sort of see the distracting. Oh, one thing I should point out, so there's a lot of settings in Camera Raw. It packs almost all of Lightroom into this one little window, which is, you know, quite amazing. We have our zoom levels here, and we can, you know, have some preset zoom levels. Tells us the image name that we're working on, tells us the monitor color space that we're at. So down here we have, and the shortcut is Q, as you can see, and we can look at the before and after. So if I cycle through this, Oh, it's taking some time to catch up. Well, I think this is going to be before and aftering. Yeah, so this is, we get, if you keep toggling through or keep clicking on this button here, or keep toggling through the Q key, it's going to show us various ways of before and aftering. So this, on the left, we have the preset as saved and as stored in the XMP file, and then the after is the results of our current session. So you can see we've sort of changed it sort of quite drastically, not necessarily for the better. So I can toggle the next look, and that's going to be, and you see that there's an indication where we have, it's the one image, but you can see round about here, you can see where the AB, we have A on this side and B on this side. You can kind of see the slight difference. It's not quite so obvious when both images are fairly heavily edited, but when we get them sort of side by side, or we see in this next one they're above and below, we can get a better idea of the before and after. So when you're correcting images and you want to see what difference you're making and how far you've come, that's really cool. And because I've got a lot of, right back to the beginning here, or to the sort of full image. Then we have, you can swap the before and after settings as a way to do like some A/B comparisons. So the shortcut for this is P. Yes, the shortcut for this is P. So if I hit P, now I'm loading back in the original settings. I can hit P again, load back in our current settings. So I am going to go to our brush settings and erase these. These I want to keep. These I want to erase these. I can just hit delete, and then I've erased those settings. I didn't like those, but I wanted to demonstrate them. Let me see. Also, so finally, as well as swapping, hitting P to swap the before and afters. Now I like the color of the before, but in the after I've removed the lens smudges. So I'm trying to get back to that. What I can do is this icon at the far right here will just toggle off the operation of just this current panel. So say I'm in the FX panel where I've got added some dehaze and vignetting, I can toggle the results just of that. What effect is that panel having on my image? So that's really cool. So if I go back to the gradient filter, seems to have cleared that up. It's removed that graduated filter. That's good. Okay, so we're at where I want to go. I've got the original color correction settings and I've removed the smudges, but I've got rid of the other edits that I wasn't happy with. So this is really cool. Swapping to do A/B comparisons, doing visual A/B comparisons before and afters. There was one more. Oh, so you can copy the current settings to the before, which you've developed an A/B, you've developed a look, or you've got an image that is unedited. You developed a look, maybe you've saved it as some snapshots along the way, you're not quite ready to save a preset, but you want to keep developing, so you can copy your current settings to the before. You can copy your after settings, which is now, to your before settings. So now both images are the same, and you can continue to develop your look. So then when you toggle your A/B, later on, you're going to have a point here in the timeline to like the current in the timeline. If that kind of makes any sense, I'll be amazed. But basically, yes, you can toggle your progress as you work through editing the color of an image and create, maybe different versions thereof. If that wasn't clear, leave a comment, chase me up afterwards, and I'll try and do a better job of answering that for you. I want to push on for now because we are well over an hour, but we're coming to the end. We've gone through, we can, last of these image tools, we've got like a power window. I'm not going to do it now because actually, let's just do that. I can always undo real quick. I can create a mask where these, and I can feather that. Let's bring that down a little bit. So I can create like a power window where that is edited, and I'm just going to delete that. So they all work in a similar way. You have the color corrections that you want to make here, and you can apply them by brush, by gradient, or by like a power window, by a vector mask. Let's take a look at the preferences real quick. Most of these aren't too important, but the important one here, sidecar XMP files. That is when the XMP file is saved next to the image. I find that most useful. You can store it in one main camera raw database, but if that database gets corrupted, then, well, don't want that. So XMP files I find to be the most useful. Apply sharpening just talks about, image previewing. I don't never change that. Don't really mess with these defaults. That seems to work well. Camera raw cache. I've set a location to I have an external SSD file that I use for all my image cache, can disk caching for After Effects, Premiere, Photoshop, and also here in Camera Raw. It all points to this fast volume, and I can give it any number of gigabytes, and more importantly, if things are getting clunky, I can purge that cache and clean things up and manage it. You have some options for handling digital negatives, how to handle JPEGs and TIFF, and also should you use your graphics card as well. So there's some preferences right there, and we have image rotation. So I've worked up my preset, and I'm happy with that, and that's saved. And I've manually retouched some spots. You don't want to save those spots touches in a preset because obviously each image is going to be different. I mean, unless you've got the same schmutz on the lens, but you're obviously going to be sampling from different points to maybe clean up that. So I tend to save a preset and then do the touch-ups afterwards. One last thing, let's select a bunch of images, and I'm going to, first of all, I can apply, so I can sort of process a number of images at once from Bridge with that preset. Very cool. If I still have these selected, open in Camera Raw, I can open these as a batch. Now I get these images in a stack at the side. Now I can increase the exposure. So what I was trying to demonstrate, and did by my ineptitude, was that when you open a batch of images in Camera Raw, the first one is selected. I thought there was a way to make a correction in the first image and then copy it to the others. And I can toggle through the images which one is being viewed here. You can get this sort of blue outline so you can see. But if you want to make the same correction to a bunch of images, other than going through one at a time and making that adjustment manually, you have to select them all, even though the blue outline is showing that I'm viewing this number one image, but the sort of grey highlight shows that I've selected them, that any adjustments I make here are now going to be applied to all four of these images. it would be nice if I could copy and paste. If I did make the mistake, and I've done this numerous times, open it up and get straight into correcting and go, oh, I should have made that to all of them. And there's no real way to, short of saving a preset and then applying that preset, which I don't always want to do, but, and obviously there's no edit, copy and paste up here. So, as I've demonstrated, you may have to go back to the original saved files, which would be image settings. That's what's saved with the XMP file, and then make the adjustment again. So you can adjust several images at once in a batch inside Camera Raw. So the oranges are very saturated. Let's go into our HSL and maybe saturation. Let's desaturate the oranges a little bit because it's got too much. And again, I haven't selected all of my, so let's desaturate the orange a bit, and all three of them will update appropriately. Now I can hit done and say those images are now saved and the XMP files will be updated, or I can open the images and they will all be opened in Photoshop. It's going to take a little while. My photo library isn't on the fastest hard drive, which is why it's spinning and struggling to keep up. It's like more of an archival drive than anything else. So just while it spins here, and it's going to go through those processes and open up all these. So that's Camera Raw, and you can see it's opened these three files because I had these three selected. If I had only had one image selected, it would have opened image and not opened images. Again, all of the Camera Raw operations will apply to whatever images are selected. You can open all those images at once, but the gotcha is whatever you do, whatever operation you do, is only going to operate on the currently selected image. Despite, you can have 100 images open, but only one of them may be currently selected. So that's a bit of a gotcha that still catches me out after, you know, all these years of using Camera Raw. So I think that was everything I wanted to touch on. That's a pretty deep dive into Camera Raw and really how to use it creatively, as well as just, you know, doing some subtle exposure, you know, cropping, straightening tools, processes. Let's say farewell. So I hope you learned something from that. It's been a long one. Thanks for sticking with me if you did. If you did like it, if you did learn something, please share or like, thumbs up. Leave a comment that you liked it, what you liked, what you learned. Maybe something I missed that you would like to share. Or if you have any questions, something didn't make sense, so I skipped over something too quickly, please leave a comment. Please consider subscribing if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, or even if you're watching this on the Facebook live stream. Follow the page on Facebook or go over to my YouTube channel and subscribe to that, and you'll get creative briefings in your inbox or in your sub feed on a semi-regular basis. Again, thanks for watching. I've been Adam from Influx. This has been Creative Briefing. Be creative, be safe, have fun, and I will see you on the next one. Cheers, bye.